What's the name of that place that Alberta was going to? The Homestead, yeah. Yeah, I told Alberta that what she needed to do on her way over there was to say 40 Hail Marys. And when she got out of the car, I mean, it's such a hard place to go to. I mean, it's one of the worst places on the face of the planet to be. And she was acting like it was such a burden for her to go. So to say 40 Hail Marys on the way over there, and by the way, my Catholic friends, I'm not putting that down. And then to take a whip and flog herself 7 times so that she would know what true misery is, because we are all suffering with her if she is at the homestead. Now, Andrew, where did he go? There he is over there. Brother, I've heard you do children's time several times, more than once. Golly, that was almost like the preacher that you're going to become. And I tell you, you had me hooked. So I wonder, I just kind of wonder, this is infomercial, Robert, by the way. I just kind of wonder, have you ever thought about what a fish thinks? I mean, that fish has swam along, it's been eating something a little smaller than itself, and it keeps eating and eating and eating, and it's just going about its business eating, and then all of a sudden it gets hooked by something, and all it can see is light coming straight at it. Have you ever thought about that? God practices catch and release until we're comfortable with the light. God practices catch and release until we're comfortable with the light of His love. If you want to join with me, you can take the insert. There's a little follow-along outline. That would be more for me to stay on track than it would be for your information. You see, God promised us in Jeremiah that He would take His word. Church, look up. That He would take His word and He'd write it upon our hearts. What part of our heart? All of it. You know those gut feelings? Sometimes those gut feelings, boy, they turn into pure joy, don't they? Sometimes those gut feelings turn into pure misery, don't they? You see, the heart is everything on the inside. It's the gut, and it is what we call the heart. It's emotion and feelings. Come on, guys. Even some of us old tough birds, we have emotions and feelings. We have a mind. And so when Paul talks about that we believe, we come to believe in our hearts, and we believe because of what we've heard, because of what we heard. And then once we believe it with all of our innards, that's a good Southern idea. May not be too high church. but Rob understood it. All right. Right here. Once we get it on the inside, that God loves us. Once we get it on the inside, it's then that it begins to come across our lips. And this is the message that Paul is proclaiming. That what's on the inside, it comes out the mouth to the outside. But that's not the way the world teaches us. The world teaches us that I see and then I believe. I see, and then I... It's the way of the world. We're always going to live here. Well, maybe not always. But we live here in this world. But what we're really trying to get to during the season of Lent is how do we catch a glimpse of the kingdom of heaven that is here and now? How can we come to know that God is with us here and now? And so there needs to be a bit of an awareness. A bit of an awareness that we live in the world, and seeing is believing. We live in the world, and seeing is believing. But God has a call upon our hearts, all of it. Everything on the inside. And it's what's in our hearts. It's in our heart that we hear God speak. And that's what Paul's talking about. It comes out of our mouth on our lips. First one. Paul is saying that faith comes from hearing, not here. Everywhere on the inside. Faith comes from hearing. Hearing what? No, hearing who? Hearing God's still, small voice speaking. Faith comes from hearing, not from seeing. Faith comes from hearing, not from seeing. I really like this story. Ken, the most Reverend Dr. Kenneth LeDuc, former pastor. You see, you can blame him. It's his fault. He introduced me to a guy named Anthony DeMello. Wow. I love this story. I've embellished it and taken it as my own. It's written down in my notes. But he speaks about these two blind men that were in they're in a pub. What's the southern word for pub? Bar. I was going to let you say that. I wasn't. I was going to let you say that. I wasn't. But they were in a pub. So says my staff parish chair. They're both blind. And they're doing what friends do. You see, friendship's made of two people that share things in common. Is that okay? And what they share in common? Well, their blindness brought them together. Come on. Their blindness brought them together. And so they're talking about their blindness, and they're talking about their desires and their feelings and their emotions and their longing. And what they want more than anything in the world is to be able to see color. Come hang out in the office with Tiffany and I. We see all kinds of color. They want to see color. And so they decide that what they'll do is they'll do a little experiment across the next week. They're going to get together the next week. And they want to know what red is like. They want to know what red is like. I love it when sermon examples show up. They want to know what, and so they each go their own separate ways. And a week later, they come back together, and they're really excited because they're two blind guys. And they want to know what it would be like to be able to see red. And so the first one begins to speak, and he says, red. Oh, that's like desire, you see. It's like a burning desire. And it just kind of overwhelms you, and it leads you, and you guides you. Anybody here know about that? Oh, yeah. Yeah, you know about that. Red is like a desire that's burning out of control. It's the most wonderful thing in the world. And the other guy sitting over here, the other blind guy, he's coming up out of his seat. No, that's not what red is like. Red is like standing out on a clear day and you feel the warmth of the sun beating down and warming you. Why, it's like taking a comforter called love and being embraced by the comfort of love. And so they argue. They argue. Two friends, they argue. They're both blind. They've never seen red in their life, but they're seeing red on the inside. And the bartender, according to my staff parish chair, calls the police and said, "We need y'all to come down here. There's two blind guys. They've both got red and white striped canes, and they're beating each other to death." You watch Congress lately? Ken and I talk several times a day as we watch this thing called General Conference unfold. And it was like listening to a group of people trying to kill each other over their experience of something that's red. Faith comes from hearing, not seeing. Paul is saying that faith in Jesus Christ that ushers in the kingdom of heaven here and now. Now is the time of salvation. Comes from hearing God speak to the heart. That's all of it. That's everything on the inside. Every sense and every experience on the inside. And so we understand division, don't we? Because we're sold out that seeing is believing. Seeing helps us navigate this world. But it doesn't necessarily teach us how to love God, to love ourselves, especially the broken part. Sometimes it's hard to love our neighbor, isn't it? You know, like the ones that's seated not that far from us in this sanctuary. But the most difficult thing I find is learning how to love myself. How about you? You see, Lent is about looking at things and preparing in a different way. You see, the first division in the church was between the disciples who saw Jesus and those who had heard that He had risen. Did you hear that? It's recorded in the Gospel of John most clearly. In John's Gospel, it's resurrection morning. Jesus has risen. And He just kind of comes walking through some walls where the disciples are gathered because they're afraid. They're afraid that what had happened to Jesus is going to happen to them. And they were afraid. They were hidden in an upper room, and Jesus walked in, but Thomas wasn't there. And when Jesus walked in the room, you remember what He said? You remember? You remember? He said, "My peace, my peace I give to you." You know what the peace of Christ is, don't you? Well, those disciples had watched Him make peace with sin on the cross. Those disciples had watched Him make peace with death. Those disciples had watched Him, seeing is believing. They had watched Him make peace with life. Phil, you got to know that if I'd have been Jesus, I wouldn't have come back to earth. I'd have gone straight to heaven. Thank God I'm not Jesus. But boy, wouldn't you like to be like Him? Wouldn't you like to be like Him? Thomas wasn't there. You see, they believed. Jesus said, my peace I give to you. My peace I give to you. The peace that He made with sin, the peace that He made with death, the peace that He made with life, I give to you. Wow. And they heard that. They heard the Son of God speak, and they believed. They believed. And it was on their lips, and they went and told the other disciples, and they bumped into Thomas. Remember the story? And Thomas said, I will never believe until I see Him, until I can place my finger in the wounds of His, come on, church, hands, and into the wounds of His feet, and into the wounds of His, see? Because in our world, seeing is believing. But Paul tells us, and Jesus tells us, that there's another set of eyes, and that there's another set of ears, and they're all on the inside. And God promised through the prophet Jeremiah that He would write all of this on everything that's on the inside. Wow. Friends, it was only a week later that Jesus came back into that room and Thomas was there. And Jesus again said, peace be with you. And He looked at Thomas and He said, here. And if you read it closely, at least I get the idea, Thomas didn't put his fingers in the wounds. No, he just said, my Lord, my God. And then Jesus goes on to say, Thomas, you believe because of what you have seen. But it's as if Jesus is speaking to us here today. Because He tells Thomas, He said, but you see, there's going to be people who believe that have never seen me. Isn't that who you are? Sunday after Sunday, you come because you believe, but you've never seen Him. But my friends, I contend that you have seen Him. I contend that we have all seen Him. Number 3, faithful people see Jesus every day. Faithful people see Jesus daily. You see, the heart is everything that's in us. You understand? You understand the nature of the heart? We just all kind of watched it, didn't we? Love is patient. Love is kind. Love doesn't insist on its own way, but sometimes it'll just come sit down right beside you and meet you where you are. Well, I think I just saw Jesus. I think I did. You see, the intentions that come from the heart is what defiles. But those are the things that Jesus suffered on a cross at Calvary. That's what I believe. That's the message that I will share until He convinces me different. And I'm looking at my boss, the chair of the administrative board. The heart is everything that's inside us. But my friends, my experience is, you tell me about yours. You see that nice car that we drive? That doesn't separate us from God and doesn't defile us. The food that we eat doesn't defile us. The clothes that we wear, they don't defile. Now, I will tell you, from my perspective, and it's somewhat of a joy and it's a burden. You see, I love to mow grass. Am I not crazy? And I've got 2 yards to mow now. And so the more property you have to take care of, the more time it takes. But it doesn't defile. It has no power to defile. And so the heart is everything inside us. And you know this because sometimes you listen to that screaming voice and in your gut feel full of desire. And sometimes it leads us right into wonderful, wonderful joy, and other times it leads us into great sorrow. And so it is with the heart and all of its feelings and emotions, and so it is in my head, because as a good church member told me one time, said, Robert, you need to spend a little more time just getting out of your head because you think too much. Some of you have already told me that. Dr. Ken tells me that quite often. He ain't Dr. Phil, by the way. He's Dr. Ken. Where we see sin, are you there yet? Where we see sin, faithful people see the wounds of Jesus' hands, the wounds of his feet, the wounds of his side. Are you there yet? You see, that's what I'm working on this Lent. I see a lot of sin and brokenness in the world. I drove by a tragedy this morning, and I didn't really know, but you see, I have been one who has drugged the tarp over the car while we waited for the jaws of life to come so that we could cut them out of the car. My heart, for a moment, it broke because there's a family in deep grief, and it looks like death claimed the victory. But then he slipped in, you see. And he said, Robert, you're looking at the wounds for my son, you see. He suffered that too. Robert, you're looking at the wounds of Christ, and he's won a victory. You're looking at the death of Christ, and he's won a victory. But how about us here? Wouldn't you love to live life? We see that's what I hear the Apostle Paul say. I don't expect you've heard it that way. But what would give the church great hope is for us just to sit down and talk about it. And if we remember, maybe, just maybe, we won't take our red and white striped sticks and begin to beat each other. Amen.